June 6, 1944, Normandy. The French countryside trembled beneath the roar of artillery. Smoke and dust clung to the hedgerows as German machine gunners fired into the endless waves of men and steel pouring onto the beaches. The Wehrmacht believed they understood their enemy, inexperienced, soft, unprepared for real war. Yet in the chaos of that morning, a German platoon watched in disbelief as American tanks rolled forward, not in twos or threes, but in dozens. The barrels of Sherman after Sherman broke through the smoke like a tide of iron, their silhouettes stretching across the fields. Prisoners taken that day, exhausted and bitter, smirked at their captors. They scoffed at the quality of these machines. Too thin, they muttered. Too weak. They laughed at the notion that these ungainly vehicles could ever match a Panther or a Tiger, but their laughter would fade, not in France, not in the moment of surrender, but weeks later, when they were led far from the battlefield, across the Atlantic, and into the heart of American industry. In the sweltering heat of an Ohio summer, rail cars groaned into the yard outside the Ford River Rouge plant. Inside, the German prisoners shuffled forward under guard. They expected to see a modest workshop, a line of crude tanks perhaps. Instead, they found themselves standing in a cathedral of steel and fire. Sparks rained down from overhead cranes that carried entire tank hulls as easily as children's toys. Endless rows of machines hammered, welded, pressed, and shaped. The noise was deafening, an orchestra of war played not by soldiers but by the labor of millions. For the Germans, who came from a nation of master craftsmen and small-scale precision workshops, it was a sight beyond comprehension. Tanks were not being built here. They were being summoned, conjured by an assembly line that never slept. The irony was cruel. On the battlefields of Europe, German tank crews mocked the Sherman. They knew its armor could not withstand a Tiger's 80mm gun. They ridiculed its reliance on numbers rather than superiority. They joked that it was a coffin, mass-produced for crews doomed to burn inside. And in the prisoner camps, they carried that laughter as a shield, a last defense of pride. But as the POWs walked through those cavernous halls, the shield cracked. They watched as workers, men and women alike, tightened bolts with lightning speed. They saw conveyor belts bringing engines, turrets, and tracks together with flawless coordination. Every few minutes, another Sherman rolled off the line, its engine roaring to life like a newborn beast. It was not just the tanks. Trucks, jeeps, artillery, aircraft, all flowed from the veins of an industrial giant that dwarfed anything they had ever known. For the Germans, war had been a contest of engineering brilliance. The Panther, the Tiger, the Stuka, all were marvels of design. Each tank was a masterpiece, hand-assembled, refined, almost bespoke. But here in the bowels of Detroit, war was not art. It was mathematics. It was scale. Where the Reich produced hundreds, America produced thousands. Where German factories were bombed into rubble, American plants roared louder, faster, day and night, stretching across a continent untouched by enemy bombs. For the POWs, the realization came like a cold wind. Their laughter had been born from arrogance, from the belief that technical superiority alone would win the war. Yet in those endless assembly lines, they saw the truth. Germany had built lions, but America had unleashed a stampede. The memory of Kasserine Pass still lingered among them, a battlefield where German panzers tore through inexperienced American troops. It had seemed then that the war's outcome was inevitable. But now, staring at the ceaseless flow of tanks, the POWs understood why the tide had turned. The Allies could afford to lose Shermans. They could build more, faster than Germany could destroy them. Every explosion on the battlefield, every tank burned, was already replaced before the smoke had cleared. War, they now saw, was not decided solely by the clash of steel in the field, but by the thunder of hammers in the factory. The prisoners stood in silence as another Sherman rolled forward, its olive-drab skin still warm from the welders' torches. The factory workers did not pause to look at them. They had no time. There was always another hull, another turret, another set of treads to assemble. And behind every finished machine, the lines kept moving, stretching into the horizon like arteries pumping lifeblood into the war effort. The Germans, once amused, now shifted uncomfortably. Pride turned to dread. They realized that they had not been fighting just the American soldier on the battlefield. They had been fighting the machinist in Chicago, the welder in Detroit, the farmer supplying steel and rubber, the entire arsenal of a nation too vast to comprehend. By the time the POWs were marched out of the River Rouge plant, the silence among them spoke louder than their earlier laughter. They had seen something greater than any Tiger tank, greater than any blitzkrieg maneuver. They had seen the weight of inevitability, forged in steel and multiplied by millions. In that moment, far from the front lines, they understood that Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. Word traveled quickly through the POW camps. Tales of America's factories spread like whispered omens. The Germans spoke of rivers of tanks, skies filled with aircraft, oceans bristling with ships. They described machines built faster than they could be destroyed, weapons born in numbers that defied imagination. The laughter that once echoed in the barracks grew quiet. For men who had fought with pride in their machines, who had believed in the invincibility of their war machine, there was now only the haunting realization that they had underestimated their enemy. The true battlefield was not only in France, Italy, or Russia. It was here, in the roaring heart of American industry, where victory was forged long before the guns fell silent. And so as night settled over the factory floor, and the sparks continued to fall like stars onto the steel below, the truth remained. America's strength was not in the brilliance of a single tank or the genius of one weapon. Its strength lay in the unrelenting rhythm of production, the unbreakable will of a nation mobilized. The German POWs had entered the factory laughing. They left it silent, for in those endless lines of Shermans and trucks, they had glimpsed the true engine of victory. Winter of 1942. Across the snowbound steppes of Russia, German panzers burned in the distance as Soviet artillery thundered without pause. Thousands of miles away in the deserts of North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps still fought with lethal precision, their tanks and tactics tearing through inexperienced Allied forces. In Berlin, German High Command believed they still had time. Time to dictate the pace of war, time to bleed their enemies dry before they could organize. What they could not see, what they did not yet understand, was that the very ground beneath their feet was shifting. While German divisions were spread across continents, fighting battles of attrition, another war was being fought in silence, far from the front lines. It was not a war of tanks or artillery, but of rivets, steel, and engines. It was the war of factories. By 1942, the United States had only just begun to unleash its full might. Before Pearl Harbor, America's military industry had been modest, geared primarily for defense. But within a year of entering the war, the transformation was staggering. Civilian factories, once producing cars, radios, refrigerators, were converted into vast assembly lines of destruction. General Motors stopped building sedans and began turning out tanks. Ford's plants no longer built trucks for farmers, but instead constructed the M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the Allied armies. Even luxury companies like Packard shifted to building aircraft engines, their chrome and polish replaced by oil and steel. At the center of this transformation was a doctrine alien to German thinking. For the Wehrmacht, quality reigned supreme. Every Tiger tank was a masterpiece, designed for domination, each component meticulously engineered. But this philosophy came at a cost. Time, resources, and manpower stretched thin. The American approach was different. It was not about perfection. It was about overwhelming production. If a Sherman could not outgun a Tiger, then 10 Shermans would swarm it. If one B-17 bomber fell, another dozen would take its place in the skies. This was a war fought with calculators as much as rifles, a contest of output where the enemy's greatest weapons could be drowned beneath waves of steel. The strategic situation of the war demanded this shift. Britain, bloodied by years of fighting alone, needed material support. The Soviet Union, battered but unyielding, required supplies to keep its armies in the field. And America answered, not with hesitation but with a tidal wave. The Lend-Lease program poured tanks, trucks, and aircraft across the Atlantic and into the icy Arctic convoys. American jeeps rolled across Russian mud, their simplicity and reliability earning them the nickname the soldier's friend. American factories became not only the lifeline of the United States, but of the entire Allied war effort. German commanders in the field began to sense something was wrong. Reports flowed in from Tunisia, Sicily, and later from Normandy. The enemy had not only improved, but multiplied. Where once a few Shermans appeared hesitantly, now columns of them stretched beyond sight. Where once the skies held a handful of Allied planes, now they were filled with formations so vast they blotted out the sun. German officers attributed these surges to Allied desperation, to wasteful strategies. But what they failed to grasp was the scale of the machine working behind it all. Even Hitler himself in his briefings remained blind to the storm. His faith in the Tiger and the Panther, in the Luftwaffe's Me-262 jets and V-weapons was unshaken. To him, German ingenuity would always eclipse crude Allied production. Yet beneath his confidence lay the seeds of disaster. War is not won by genius alone. It is won by momentum, by the relentless capacity to replace what is lost. America, untouched by bombing, blessed with vast natural resources and unparalleled industrial infrastructure, was building momentum that could not be stopped. For the German soldier on the front, the shift was felt not in factories but in the mud and smoke of battle. In North Africa, they watched as new American divisions arrived with endless convoys of trucks, every vehicle gleaming with fresh paint, every soldier supplied with rations and ammunition in quantities unimaginable to them. In Italy, they faced wave after wave of artillery fire, supplied by shells that seemed inexhaustible. And in France, after D-Day, they encountered the full weight of Allied industry. Endless tanks, swarming aircraft, and soldiers who never seemed to run out of equipment. The mismatch was not merely in numbers but in doctrine. German blitzkrieg had relied on speed, coordination, and shock. It was a strategy designed to collapse enemies before they could mobilize. But against the United States, the opposite was true. America mobilized faster than anyone in history. Factories that had once produced a few hundred cars now produced thousands of tanks. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than the U-boats could sink them, sometimes completing a vessel in under a week. Every time the Germans believed they had inflicted crippling losses, the Allies returned with more. The POWs who laughed at Sherman tanks did so out of ignorance. They had not yet seen what those tanks represented. Each Sherman was not just a machine of war, but a symbol of an industrial strategy Germany could never match. Each one carried within it the weight of millions of workers, the raw power of an economy unscarred by war at home, the will of a nation united in purpose. By late 1943, German officers began to mutter the unthinkable, that the war could not be won through superiority of weapons alone. Rommel himself warned that the Allies' supply chains were stretching beyond imagination, that their logistics could not be matched. Yet his warnings went unheeded. Berlin still clung to the belief that brilliance could defeat mass, that one Tiger could defeat 10 Shermans. But on the horizon the storm was building, a storm not of tanks or soldiers, but of factories. And so the context was set. As the war raged across continents, as cities burned and front lines shifted, a quiet truth emerged, unnoticed by those who laughed in their prison camps. The true weapon of the United States was not the Sherman's cannon or the B-17's bomb load. It was the factory floor. It was the unbroken hum of machinery, the sparks flying in endless shifts, the tide of production that rolled forward day after day. The Germans did not yet understand it, but soon when they saw it with their own eyes, their laughter would die in their throats. Autumn 1943. Deep in the heart of occupied France, German tank crews sat huddled in their dugouts, confident that their iron beasts, the Tigers and Panthers, would dominate whatever the Allies could muster. They told stories of American Shermans bursting into flames at the first hit, of green crews fleeing the battlefield in panic. They laughed at the notion that the United States could truly challenge Germany's armored might. But far across the Atlantic, in places they had never heard of, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, the real weapon was being forged. Not in secret laboratories or underground bunkers, but on open factory floors where steel, rubber, and fire merged into a torrent of war machines. The hidden advantage was not a new tank, not a revolutionary gun, not even a radical tactic. It was something deceptively simple, yet devastating in its consequences. Industrial scale. While German factories were handcrafting machines of perfection, American factories were mass-producing machines of war. The Germans built Tigers like master watchmakers, assembling a priceless timepiece, delicate, exact, but slow. The Americans built Shermans the way farmers built fences, quickly, efficiently, one after another, stretching endlessly into the horizon. To the German mind, quality was everything. The Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun could pierce a Sherman frontally at ranges the Americans could scarcely answer. The Tiger's 88mm cannon was feared across every front, its armor seemingly impenetrable. But this superiority came at a steep price. Each Tiger consumed nearly 300,000 man-hours to construct, requiring scarce resources Germany could barely provide. In contrast, an American Sherman rolled off the line in a fraction of the time, costing less than half the labor and materials. For every Tiger built, the United States produced nearly 10 Shermans. The advantage was not only in tanks. Radios told the same story. In the field, American tanks spoke to one another through FM radios, their voices crackling clearly even under fire. German tankers, by contrast, relied on older AM sets that sputtered with static, often leaving crews isolated. It was not just about machines, it was about connection, coordination, and momentum. The Americans had turned war into a problem of logistics, and they had solved it with terrifying efficiency. Prisoners captured after battles in North Africa and Italy scoffed at their captors. They mocked the Sherman as a Ronson, a lighter that lights every time. They believed the Americans foolish, sending waves of inferior tanks against German armor. But their smirks masked ignorance. They did not yet see the factories where the real war was being decided. In their minds, a war was won by the sharpness of a blade, the thickness of armor, the range of a gun. But America had changed the equation. War in the American doctrine was not a duel. It was an avalanche. German officers, in their after-action reports, began to note an unsettling pattern. Whenever they destroyed Allied units, replacements arrived with alarming speed. Tanks that should have taken months to replace appeared within weeks. Divisions shattered in Tunisia were reconstituted in Sicily. Losses on Omaha Beach were replenished by the time the Allies pushed into Normandy's hedgerows. The Germans wondered, how could their enemy replenish so quickly? What reservoir of strength did they draw from? The answer was simple and terrifying. They drew from an industrial machine that dwarfed Germany's by every measure. This hidden advantage, the factory floor, was invisible to most Germans until they were captured and brought to America. For them, the realization struck like a hammer blow. In Detroit, they saw assembly lines where hundreds of engines, turrets, and hulls moved together in perfect rhythm. In Buffalo, they watched women riveting aircraft fuselages with relentless precision. In Cleveland, they witnessed steel poured in rivers of molten fire, shaping not art but weapons. It was then that the laughter died. They understood too late that every Sherman on the battlefield was not alone. It was the vanguard of an industrial ocean. The Germans had underestimated the very thing they mocked. They saw the Sherman as weak, but failed to see it as a system. Each Sherman represented a promise, that when it fell, another would take its place, and another still. This was the weapon Germany could not fight, a machine that replaced itself faster than it could be destroyed. It was not only about tanks. Trucks, jeeps, artillery, aircraft all came in numbers that defied imagination. German soldiers facing the Allies often marveled with bitterness at the sheer abundance of American supplies. A soldier recalled with disbelief that every American carried more food, ammunition, and equipment than entire German squads could hope to gather. The abundance seemed almost wasteful, but it revealed the truth. America was waging war not on the scale of divisions, but of nations. Every farm, every factory, every city had been mobilized into a single unbreakable war machine. The irony was cruel. The same POWs who once laughed at Shermans would later whisper among themselves about the factories they had seen. They spoke of endless lines of tanks, of bombers being built faster than they could be shot down, of ships sliding into the water before U-boats could even position themselves. The hidden advantage had been invisible at the front, masked by the fire and smoke of battle. But when exposed, it was undeniable. Germany had been fighting not an army, but a continent armed with machinery and will. The laughter of German prisoners, so full of scorn in the beginning, became a hollow echo of a pride that could no longer stand against reality. For in those factories they realized the terrible truth they had already lost long before they knew it. September 19th, 1944, Lorraine, France. Dawn broke cold and grey over the fields near Aricourt as fog crept low across the ground, muffling the rumble of engines. Hidden within the mist, 39 German Panthers prepared to strike, their long guns angled forward, their crews confident. The Americans, the Germans believed, would crumble once again. Yet as the battle began, confusion gripped the Panther formations. Shots rang out from unseen positions. Shermans darted from behind hedgerows, fired and vanished before the Panthers could turn their turrets. Radio chatter within the German ranks dissolved into chaos. They were facing an enemy that seemed everywhere and nowhere at once, moving with uncanny coordination. When the fog lifted hours later, German tankers realized something horrifying. They had been outmaneuvered not by superior tanks, but by an enemy whose machines moved and communicated as if linked by an unseen thread. The thread was technology, and it had been forged in the factories back home. The hidden heart of America's advantage lay in its machines, designed not as isolated marvels, but as cogs in a larger system. Every Sherman tank carried the SCR 508 frequency modulation radio, a squat steel-bodied device weighing 181 pounds. At its core were 2,748 components, aligned with ruthless precision. Its 25-watt crystal-controlled output could reach 10 miles under fire, far exceeding the range and clarity of the German Fuji-5 sets. Where German radios crackled with static, losing coherence in the storm of battle, the American sets cut through with piercing clarity. A single commander could redirect an entire company in seconds. Orders traveled faster than the German tanks could turn their turrets. The technical difference seemed small, mere numbers on paper. But war is not won on paper. War is won in the heat of chaos, where seconds decide whether men live or die. For German crews, a platoon leader struck by Allied fire meant silence. Subordinate tanks, unsure of orders, often froze or fought blindly. For American crews, a lost commander was only a voice replaced. Any tank at any moment could assume control. Radios ensured fluidity, resilience, and speed, qualities that turned supposedly inferior machines into predators. And radios were only the beginning. The Sherman itself was a marvel of production engineering. Its welded hulls were shaped on massive hydraulic presses in Detroit, stamping steel with thunderous force. Each hull rolled to the next station, where engines built by Chrysler and Ford were lowered into place. The standard power plant, a Continental R975 radial engine, delivered 400 horsepower from 9 cylinders, a repurposed aircraft design that had been adapted for the ground. With a top road speed of 25 miles per hour, the Sherman was not fast by car standards, but in armored warfare its agility outpaced German heavies. Where a Tiger lumbered forward like a fortress, the Sherman slipped through mud hills and forests, swarming like wolves. Production scale amplified the advantage. Detroit's arsenal of democracy turned out 25 Shermans a day at peak output. Between 1942 and 1945, over 49,000 Shermans were built, more than all German tanks combined. Chrysler's massive Detroit tank arsenal sprawled across 113 acres, employing 25,000 workers on rotating shifts that never slept. A Sherman could be assembled in under 30 days, from raw steel to battle-ready machine. Tigers, by contrast, required 6 months of hand labor and rare materials that grew scarcer as Allied bombers pounded the Reich. The German POWs who walked through these American factories could scarcely believe it. They had come from a world where production was measured in dozens, not tens of thousands. In Germany, tanks were crafted like instruments. In America, they were hammered out like nails. Each machine was not a singular work of genius. It was part of a storm, a relentless tide, designed to overwhelm. Aircraft told the same story. At Willow Run, Ford's colossal plant stretched a mile long and half a mile wide. Here, B-24 Liberator bombers took shape with machine-like regularity. Before Ford's engineers redesigned the process, building a single bomber took half a year. At Willow Run, one bomber left the line every hour. The plant's motto was not whispered pride, but bold certainty. 1 an hour. By war's end, Willow Run had produced over 8,600 B-24s, more than Japan built heavy bombers in the entire war. Technical numbers spoke louder than boasts. A Liberty ship, the steel lifeline of Allied logistics, carried 10,000 tons of cargo. American shipyards built over 2,700 of them. One yard set a record, completing a Liberty ship in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. To the German mind, trained to see war in the elegance of a tank duel or the dive of a Stuka, these numbers were unthinkable. Yet to American engineers, they were simply the solution to an equation: win by building faster than the enemy can destroy. Every component of America's war machine echoed the same principle. radios that connected, engines that were reliable and easy to maintain. Tanks built not for perfection but for numbers, ships launched in waves, bombers that rained destruction, not because they were invincible, but because they were endless. And in this technical symphony a truth emerged. Germany had mastered the art of the individual weapon. America had mastered the art of the system. The system could absorb losses, adapt, and strike again with multiplied force. The system could turn battlefields into factories of attrition, where German brilliance was smothered beneath American momentum. The German POWs, staring at the humming assembly lines, understood too late that they had misjudged their enemy. They had mistaken the Sherman for weakness, when in fact it was a harbinger. Each rivet, each bolt, each radio frequency told the same story. This war would not be decided by the sharpness of a single blade, but by the weight of an industrial hammer. September 19th, 1944. The morning fog lifted over Lorraine, revealing the wreckage of one of the strangest and most decisive tank clashes of the war. At Aricourt, German commanders had thrown 39 Panthers into the fray, believing sheer firepower would sweep the Americans from the field. The Panthers were apex predators, their long 75mm guns capable of destroying Shermans at ranges the Americans could barely match. Yet by the day's end, many of those mighty machines lay smoldering in the fields, their blackened carcasses silent reminders of a truth the Germans had refused to see. America's tanks did not fight alone. The battle unfolded like a chess match played at lightning speed. Shermans darted between hedgerows, their smaller profiles disappearing into the folds of the French countryside. When one tank was struck, two more moved to flank. FM radios crackled as commanders issued rapid-fire orders, entire platoons shifting position as if guided by a single mind. German Panther crews, peering through smoke and confusion, could not comprehend how their prey always seemed one step ahead. When German officers demanded explanations afterward, their crews described the Americans as ghosts, appearing, striking, vanishing. What they had witnessed was not supernatural. It was coordination at a scale the Wehrmacht had never mastered. Numbers told the brutal truth. At Aricourt, the Germans lost 86 tanks in less than 2 weeks of fighting. The Americans, despite their supposedly inferior machines, lost fewer than 30 Shermans. On paper, the exchange should have been reversed, but the Germans fought as isolated predators, each Panther powerful but alone. The Americans fought as a pack, their radios knitting them together into something greater than the sum of their parts. Aricourt was not an isolated story. From the sands of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, similar patterns emerged. At El Guetar in March 1943, German panzers surged forward in tight formations, expecting the Americans to collapse. Instead, coordinated artillery fire and swarming counterattacks forced Rommel's men into retreat. At Mortain in August 1944, Hitler ordered a desperate counteroffensive to cut off the Allied advance. German tanks advanced boldly, but American coordination, infantry, artillery, and air power linked by radio, halted the attack and shredded German armor. The pattern repeated: shock, confusion, collapse. After-action reports from German units revealed mounting frustration. One officer complained that American tanks seemed to multiply after each engagement, no matter how many were destroyed. Another wrote bitterly that American artillery was everywhere at once, striking targets with uncanny precision. They were not wrong. Behind each battlefield lay the factories that fed the fight. When German crews destroyed 10 Shermans, 20 more were already on the way. When they silenced one American artillery battery, dozens more fired in its place. The psychological toll was immense. German tankers who once ridiculed the Sherman began to dread it, not because of its armor or gun, but because of its persistence. A Tiger might crush a column of Shermans today, but tomorrow a new column would arrive. For crews already exhausted by endless combat, the knowledge that their victories changed nothing gnawed at morale. Captured diaries and interrogations revealed the despair. One POW admitted that fighting Americans is like trying to hold back the sea. You destroy one wave and another comes. There is no end. Others confessed their bewilderment at American logistics. How could the enemy feed so many tanks, so many aircraft, so many men? Even as Germany starved under Allied bombing, the Americans seemed to grow stronger by the day. The battles also exposed the limits of German doctrine. Blitzkrieg had been built on speed and surprise, But by 1944, the surprise was gone. American production ensured that even disastrous losses could be replaced in weeks. Blitzkrieg's lightning strikes faltered against an enemy that never stayed broken. And when the Allies seized the initiative after Normandy, German forces found themselves fighting a war of attrition they could not win. Ericourt was proof. Panthers, built at immense cost and touted as Germany's armored salvation, had been gutted not by better tanks, but by better systems. Shermans, connected by radio and backed by the unshakable weight of factories, had turned weakness into strength. The German crews who survived Ericourt carried back stories of shock and disbelief. They had seen their best weapons fail, not because of technical flaws, but because they faced an enemy who fought as one organism. In POW camps, those same crews would later walk through American factories and recognize the connection. The swarming Shermans, the endless artillery barrages, the bombers filling the sky, it had all begun here on the assembly lines. The battlefield was only the visible tip of a vast machine. The true engine of war was not in the fields of France, but in the roaring forges of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. The first major battles where America's hidden advantage revealed itself were not just military victories. They were psychological earthquakes. They shattered the German illusion of superiority and replaced it with dread. And for those who had once laughed at the clumsy Sherman, the memory of Ericourt silenced their laughter forever. Autumn 1944. In the ruined villages of Lorraine, smoke still hung over the shattered fields of Ericourt. German crews who had survived the clash sat in silence staring at the wreckage of their vaunted Panthers. The shock was not just in the loss of tanks, but in the manner of their destruction. They had not been defeated by superior armor or heavier guns. They had been undone by something intangible, an invisible advantage that gave their enemy endurance, cohesion, and an uncanny ability to recover from setbacks. The realization spread slowly but surely. This was not simply a battle lost, but a glimpse into the collapse of German armored supremacy. The strategic implications rippled outward across every theater of war. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets pressed relentlessly westward, supplied not only by their own vast war effort, but by a flood of American trucks, radios, and aircraft through Lend-Lease. Red Army offensives gained a momentum the Wehrmacht could not match, fueled by convoys of Studebaker trucks carrying supplies across the mud and snow. German officers complained bitterly that their enemies seemed inexhaustible. And in truth they were, for behind every Allied soldier stood the arsenal of America's factories. For the men on the ground, the psychological weight of this realization was crushing. German tankers had once entered battle with confidence, trusting their Panthers and Tigers to dominate. But now every engagement carried a shadow of doubt. Even a successful ambush, even a hard-fought victory meant little. The enemy would return the next day with fresh tanks, fresh supplies, fresh divisions. Losses that would have crippled a German unit were little more than inconveniences for the Americans. In letters home, soldiers admitted the growing futility. "We fight, we destroy, but it changes nothing," wrote one panzer commander in late 1944. "Their machines come back faster than we can burn them." The psychological contrast between the two armies was stark. For Americans, the radio was more than equipment. It was lifeline and reassurance. A tank crew under fire could call instantly for artillery or air support. A pinned-down infantry platoon could summon tanks within minutes. Soldiers felt connected, part of a vast web that stretched beyond their vision. For Germans, combat increasingly meant isolation. Orders failed to reach units. Tanks moved blindly when commanders fell. Artillery lacked coordination. Soldiers felt abandoned even when surrounded by comrades. That loneliness more than enemy fire eroded morale. At the strategic level, the same pattern held true. Germany's war machine was built for quick victories, for lightning strikes that collapsed enemies before they could organize. But against the United States, speed and surprise lost their edge. The American system could absorb shocks and come back stronger. Defeats like Kasserine Pass were not the end, but the beginning of adaptation. Losses that would have crippled smaller nations became lessons written in blood, corrected in weeks by an industry and command structure that learned, adapted, and rebuilt with astonishing speed. German intelligence began reporting not just on Allied weapons, but on Allied production. Reports from POW interrogations and captured documents painted a grim picture. factories producing thousands of tanks and aircraft each month, shipyards launching vessels faster than U-boats could sink them, supply lines stretching across oceans with endless replacements. By late 1944, German generals knew they were no longer fighting a conventional enemy. They were fighting an industrial colossus, one that could not be bled dry. The impact reached deep into the minds of German soldiers. Many POWs later admitted that their first glimpses of American factories were more demoralizing than combat itself. To stand beneath the cavernous ceilings of the River Rouge plant, to watch tanks and trucks rolling off the line without pause, was to witness inevitability. It was one thing to face Shermans on the battlefield and mock their thin armor. It was another to see endless replacements summoned from the heart of America's economy. The realization that the enemy could never run out, that every tank destroyed was already replaced, was devastating. In this, the American advantage was not just material but psychological. Every Sherman rolling forward carried with it more than steel and firepower. It carried the weight of certainty. For the crews who drove them, there was confidence that they were part of something unstoppable. For the Germans who faced them, there was the creeping despair of inevitability. That contrast broke more than tanks. It broke spirits. The war by 1944 was no longer a contest of equals. It had become a war of endurance, and endurance was something Germany could not hope to match. Cities lay in ruins under Allied bombing. Factories struggled to function under shortages and sabotage. Trains ran less often. Coal ran thin, oil grew scarce. Every tiger that rolled out of a German factory was a marvel, but it was also a miracle, born of dwindling resources and constant delays. Every Sherman that rolled off an American line was routine, one of thousands, backed by a system that only grew stronger with each passing month. The psychological toll of this imbalance was clear. German officers wrote of fighting two wars, one against the enemy in front of them and one against despair within their own ranks. Veterans who had once marched proudly into France and Russia now spoke in hushed tones of endless enemies, of battles fought not to win, but to delay the inevitable. Prisoners who had once laughed at Shermans fell silent when asked about the factories. Some admitted openly that no strategy, no weapon could overcome such numbers. The strategic and psychological impact of America's hidden advantage was decisive. It robbed Germany of hope, of confidence, of the belief that brilliance and courage alone could carry the day. And as Sherman after Sherman rolled into battle, supported by endless supplies, the laughter of German prisoners faded into a heavy silence. They had glimpsed not just the might of an enemy's machines, but the will of an entire nation, forged in steel and multiplied beyond imagination. Spring 1945. Across a collapsing Reich, the smoke of ruined cities blotted out the sky. The thunder of Allied bombers rolled overhead, a sound so constant that German civilians no longer flinched when the sirens wailed. On the ground, American columns pushed eastward, their Shermans clattering through villages that once seemed distant and untouchable. Behind those advancing tanks stretched convoys of trucks, endless miles of supplies, and the assurance that whatever was lost today would be replaced tomorrow. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, still fighting with grim determination, the final truth was sinking in. This was a war they could not win. The legacy of America's industrial advantage was written not just in battles, but in the minds of those who fought them. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel would later admit bitterly that we built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together. In those words lay the essence of the war's outcome. Germany had relied on engineering brilliance, on weapons crafted like jewels. But war was not a contest of craftsmanship. It was a contest of systems, and in that contest America had been unrivaled. The prisoners who once laughed at Shermans had seen the truth with their own eyes. They had walked through Detroit's tank arsenal, through Ford's Willow Run plant, through factories where sparks rained like stars and machines were born by the thousands. They had watched Liberty ships slide into the water faster than U-boats could sink them, had seen B-24 bombers lined up wingtip to wingtip, ready to blacken the skies. For them, laughter had curdled into awe, and awe into despair. This transformation was more than industrial. It was psychological. The American war machine had not only supplied armies, but reshaped the very nature of modern conflict. Radios linked every tank, every gun, every plane into a network of coordination. Production ensured that losses were temporary inconveniences, not fatal blows. Logistics delivered supplies across oceans and continents with precision that seemed impossible. Together, these forces created a new doctrine of war, one where connection, speed, and numbers mattered more than the brilliance of a single weapon. The legacy carried far beyond 1945. In the Cold War, the lessons of American industry became the blueprint for a new kind of warfare. Network-centric operations, born in the static-laced voices of Sherman radios, evolved into global systems of satellites and command networks. The principle that won World War II, that connection outweighed firepower, echoed in the Gulf War of 1991. When American forces dismantled Iraqi divisions through coordination and overwhelming logistics rather than tank-for-tank duels, it resonates even today, in a world where wars are fought not only with missiles but with information, speed, and integration. For veterans, the memory of that transformation remained seared into their lives. American crews remembered the confidence their radios gave them, the reassurance that they were never truly alone. German veterans remembered the opposite, the isolation, the static, the silence when commanders fell. Families of soldiers carried these stories for generations, reminders that the war was not only about courage on the battlefield, but about the unseen forces that shaped it, the factory worker's rivet, the engineer's design, the machinist's shift deep into the night. And for gamers, history buffs, and engineers of the modern era, the tale of America's factories remains a lesson in scale. The Sherman may never have matched the Tiger in armor or gun, but as part of a living system, it achieved something greater. It turned inferiority into advantage. It made numbers a weapon. It embodied the truth that in war, speed and connection can overwhelm even the strongest armor. The German POWs who once smirked at the sight of American tanks never forgot what they saw in those vast plants. Their laughter, once sharp and confident, had dissolved into silence. They understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, that the war had been decided not on the fields of France or the steppes of Russia, but in the roaring furnaces and assembly lines of America. Victory had been forged long before D-Day, long before Aracourt, long before Berlin fell. And so the story closes not with a single battle, but with a lesson as eternal as war itself. The Tiger may have been a lion, feared and respected, but the Sherman was the wolf pack, relentless, coordinated and unending. In the end, lions can kill wolves, but they cannot stop the pack. The factories of America had shown the world that modern war belonged not to the sharpest blade, but to the heaviest hammer. Not to the masterpiece, but to the multitude. It was a lesson carved into steel, written in fire and proven by victory. For those who fought, for those who watched, and for those who remember, the truth stands unshaken. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor. The laughter of German prisoners had been silenced forever, drowned out by the unrelenting roar of America's factories. Winter 1945. The guns of Europe finally fell silent, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a world forever changed. Cities lay in rubble, their streets lined with the scars of fire and steel. Millions mourned their dead, while millions more struggled to piece together lives shattered by years of relentless war. And in the ashes of that devastation, one truth became impossible to ignore. Victory had not been decided by the brilliance of a single weapon or the courage of a single soldier. It had been forged in the roar of furnaces, in the hum of conveyor belts, in the ceaseless rhythm of America's factories. For German prisoners of war, the journey from laughter to silence told the story more clearly than any textbook could. They had entered captivity mocking the Sherman, deriding it as little more than a rolling coffin. They had clung to the pride of their Tigers and Panthers, convinced that quality would always crush quantity. But when they saw the truth, when they stood inside the cavernous halls of Detroit and Willow Run, watching machines roll endlessly from the lines, their laughter died. They realized they had been fighting not just an army, but an entire nation mobilized with a force they could never match. The legacy of those factories extended far beyond the war. In the decades that followed, the world entered a new age of conflict, the Cold War, where production, logistics, and technology remained decisive. The same principles that had allowed Shermans to swarm Tigers became the foundation of NATO strategy, overwhelmed by coordination, by scale, by systems that connected armies into a single organism. From the jungles of Korea to the deserts of the Gulf, the lesson repeated: the most advanced weapon means little if it stands alone. Victory belongs to the side that can produce, connect, and endure. For veterans, the memories of that truth lived on. American tank crews remembered the relief of hearing voices over their radios, the knowledge that help was always within reach. They recalled the pride of driving machines that might not have been perfect, but which never left them isolated. German veterans remembered the opposite, the silence when commanders were struck, the frustration of static-filled radios, the despair of watching endless waves of Shermans reappear, no matter how many they destroyed. To them, the sound of America's factories became a haunting echo, the invisible drumbeat of their defeat. And for the families of those who served, the story carried forward. Fathers and grandfathers told their children not only of battles but of the machines that made them possible, of the convoys that stretched across oceans, of the factories that never slept. The lesson became part of a shared inheritance, that wars are not won by brilliance alone, but by resilience, unity, and the capacity to endure longer than the enemy. Even today, the images resonate. Gamers relive the clash of Shermans and Tigers in virtual battlefields. Engineers marvel at the efficiency of the assembly lines, at the way America retooled its entire economy in a matter of months. Historians point to the arsenal of democracy as one of the decisive factors of the 20th century. And veterans, now old and grey, sit quietly with memories of radios crackling, engines roaring, and factories that churned like beating hearts across the ocean. The conclusion is inescapable. Germany built better tanks, but America built tanks that fought together. Germany built weapons of brilliance. America built weapons of endurance. So, in the end, the war belonged not to the sharper sword, but to the army that could swing its hammer again and again without pause. For the German POWs who had once laughed, the silence they carried home after the war spoke volumes. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and it haunted them. For them, the war had ended not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the blinding sparks of Detroit's assembly lines, in the endless roar of engines that could not be stopped. And so the story of their laughter stands as more than anecdote. It is a warning etched into history. The greatest weapon of the 20th century was not the Tiger, not the Sherman, not the bombers or the battleships. It was the factory. It was the system that turned resources into machines, machines into armies, and armies into victory. Modern generals and strategists still whisper the same lesson in war colleges and planning rooms. Connection outweighs firepower. Speed defeats armor. Hand scale, cold, relentless industrial scale, crushes brilliance every time. The war that began with laughter ended with silence. And in that silence lies the eternal truth of modern conflict. That victory is not born in the battlefield alone, but in the unseen forges that shape the battlefield long before the first shot is fired. The German POWs had entered America's factories laughing. They left them silent. The factories had spoken louder than any general, any tank, any cannon. They had spoken with the voice of inevitability, and that voice still echoes today.